way I like to start this is by saying this. There's a great quote by a person named Jim Pluteman. He says, "The biblical text is without error and is inspired by God, but my interpretation is not." And my interpretation can even include, now this is going to be a little controversial, but can include a biblical translation. Because the biblical translations are the interpretations of scholars and scribes who have written down for us to read their interpretation of what they're reading. And that's great. That's helpful. We need that. It's just that what I want us to look at today will help us to see that there's even more for us to understand. And so one of the things that I wanted us to start with is this fact that people in the West think differently than people in the East. And so when you have a Western thinker, what you'll get is, let's say that I want to learn about a frog. So a Western thinker will go out to a pond, and they'll go out there and they'll grab a frog, they'll trap it, they'll take it back to a lab, they'll put it in some chloroform, they'll slice it open and figure it out. In the Eastern world, a way to discover the workings of a frog is they'll go out to where the frog is, and they'll sit down and they'll watch the frog in its natural habitat. Because Western thinkers are pragmatic in our thinking. We like things to make practical sense. And we don't necessarily measure that by what we see, but by how we interact with it, how we work it, how we can dig inside of it and see how the heart pumps and how the stomach works and all those kinds of things. That's what we learn now. In the West, they visualize it, they picture. They're more visual learners than in the West. So Eastern thinkers are visual in their thinking. Western thinkers are more pragmatic in their thinking. For instance, here's an example. I want you to give me throw out some words. If I say God is, what are some of the ways that you would describe God? God is
good.
Good. God is good. What's another one?
Love.
God is love. What's another one?
Powerful.
God is powerful. And so in the West, we have a tendency to describe God with words. But they're not picture words. In the East, they describe God with words like He's a rock. He's a shepherd. He is a nursing mother. Those kinds of things. I think that's one of the examples that Ray Vanderlaan shares. And so when they describe God to people, they give people a picture of this is what God is like. God is like a mountain. God is a fortress. That kind of thing. So there's a picture that they can see. And in the West, we just typically use words that are more pragmatic, that define something. In the East, they use words that paint a picture of what God is. Now, one of the things that I want us to just talk about today, and this is, now that we kind of have that little bit of an idea, we don't have a whole lot of time, so what I want to do is dig right into this. But what I want to talk about is the garb of first century Jewish folks. And what we'll see is that they basically wear two particular pieces of clothing. One is called a haluk, and the haluk is that undergarment. It's like a robe. It's a robe that is literally would be considered somewhat of like an underwear, an undergarment in the first century Jewish world. So that Jesus and other Jewish people would wear their haluk. Let's say they were at home. Kind of like you would. You have these two-piece pajamas, guys, where they have the button up. I remember one time I was traveling with a couple of guys, and one of the guys wore a onesie. It was kind of funny, but that's what he liked. He said it's comfortable, keeps his feet warm, and all that stuff. And so this guy, he's a great guy. He's a funny guy. I'm not going to mention his name. He'll kill me. What's that?
Friend of yours?
Yeah, friend of mine. And so he wears this onesie. And but if you're wearing like two-piece pajamas, you might even go outside if it's cold, right? And walk outside in your two-piece pajamas and go get a piece of wood for the fire if you have a fireplace. You might put on your robe and you might run out to the mailbox and you might check the mail. But what you wouldn't do is you wouldn't go to work in your robe and pajamas, and you wouldn't go to church, and you wouldn't do a lot of formal activities, things considered public. So the haluk was a garb that was normal to wear, but it wasn't normal to wear without the talit. The talit is the prayer shawl. The prayer shawl is really important for us to understand from this day, because what it's going to do by us understanding the prayer shawl is it also helps us to understand something about the scriptures that we may not pick up on otherwise. And so, for example, let's climb through this. The prayer shawl is called a talit. And the talit came to be known as a little tent. And why was it called a little tent? Well, because 6 million Jews would attempt to worship God in the tabernacle, which was a large tent, but they couldn't all fit inside. So what they would do is they would use these as private tabernacles. And so they could put on their talit and wear it like this. And then when it was time to worship, when people were worshiping God, what they would do is they would consider this to be their individual tabernacle. So that literally what they would do is they would go into their prayer closet like this, and they would pray to God. And it would be a private tent. And so when Jesus says, go into your closet and pray, he's talking about the talit, because they wore them everywhere. And if you couldn't fit into the tabernacle, you could still join the tabernacle by symbolize. You would symbolize being in the tabernacle by wearing your talit, by going into your closet. And so you would literally close the door to your tent and pray. And how many of you love, I remember when I was a little kid, and I used to have, remember when we were little, and the watches that glowed? I used to love to put it under the lamp, right? And when Mom would make us turn off the lights and we couldn't stay up anymore, but I wasn't really necessarily ready right then to fall asleep, I would put the cover over me, the blanket over me, and I would literally just sit in there with my little watch glowing, and it felt like I was in my own little world, my own little private place. And so in a way, that's what this became. The talit became something of a little tent, or it was known as a prayer closet. And that's Matthew 6:6, where Jesus says, go into your closet and close the door. And then he goes on to say, and pray to your Father in secret. In Acts 18:1-3, we read of Paul being a tent maker. Something really important for us to understand, and I'll see if I have it on here, is that for a tent maker, there were large tents. I guess there were large tents. People made tents, especially like today. Even today, they have the tent dwellers known as the Bedouin shepherds. They are direct descendants of those ancient Hebrews who lived in tents in the desert. And so you would need people to make these tents. But here's what's really, really intriguing about this, is that a rabbi had to be present to tie for the tying of the tzitzi. These are called tzitzi. If there's more than one, it's tzitzi yoked. But this is a tzitzi. And because a rabbi like Paul had to be present, it can be very likely that Paul was not just a tent maker, but a little tent maker. He made prayer shawls, and he was present at the tying of the tzitzi. And we're going to talk about the significance of how these are tied. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. A kanaf is the word for the edges of this. And as you can see, when you spread it out, what kind of visual do you kind of get? Like a bird. Okay? So a kanaf, or kanafim in plural, means wings also. Okay, so sometimes these kanaf, the kanaf of, or the edges of these were known as the wings of the prayer shawl as well. So, and then on the edge of these wings, or the kanafim, they would tie these tzitzi. And Psalm 17:8